This is Samuel. It was in the middle of a crowded bank branch, under the weight of dozens of cold, judgmental stares, that a manager publicly accused him of being a beggar, ordering him to leave so as not to disturb the real customers. The humiliation was a dry echo that silenced everyone present. A blow aimed at crushing the dignity of that gentleman with worn clothes and dark skin marked by time. It was a brutal test of faith and patience. Have you ever felt the weight of such an unfair judgment on your shoulders? Has your faith ever been tested in this way? Before I tell you how God acted in his life after that public humiliation, comment here where you are watching from and subscribe to the channel. Believe me, you won't want to miss what happens when we place such an affront in his hands. The conflict began the moment Samuel arrived at the manager's desk. Ricardo, a man who wore his arrogance like an expensive suit, did not even greet him. His eyes ran over the 72-year-old man's body, measuring the faded fabric of his shirt, the old shoes, and the calmness that seemed out of place in that environment of haste and money. For Ricardo, the calculation was simple. A poor appearance meant trouble or insignificance. Without giving Samuel a chance to say a single word, he projected his voice, ensuring the nearest customers would hear his authority. "Sir, if you've come to ask for alms or help, this is not the place. This line is for customers. Please leave so you don't disturb those who have business to attend to." The sentence was a verdict, spoken with a contempt that froze the air. Inside, Samuel felt the heat of the affront rise in his chest. The first reaction, the human and instinctive one, was to defend himself, to raise his voice and demand the respect that every human being deserves. He felt the blood pulse stronger in his temples, the memory of other silent humiliations throughout his life surfacing like ghosts. But, as quickly as it came, this wave of anger was contained by another force, one much older and more powerful within him. It was faith, the discipline of a lifetime of knees on the ground and conversations with God. He took a deep breath, an act that was imperceptible to others, but for him it was a prayer. He asked God for serenity, not to be carried away by the enemy's trap, who wanted to see him explode and lose his reason. The bank branch was the perfect setting for that ordeal, a cold place, with a polished marble floor that reflected the impersonal white lights from the ceiling. The dominant sound was a mixture of hurried conversations, the beeping of machines, and the nervous typing of employees. The people in line were a portrait of urban impatience, tired faces, eyes fixed on their cell phones, audible sighs with every minute of waiting. No one seemed to notice the person next to them, except to judge, and in that temple of capital, where a person's worth was measured by their bank statement, Samuel's presence, with his serenity and simple clothes, was an anomaly. He was a point of calm amidst the chaos, and this somehow disturbed the hurried order of things, attracting looks of disdain long before he reached the manager. That man was Samuel, a retired carpenter who carried in his 72 years the wisdom of someone who has seen almost everything in this life. A widower for 5 years, he found in his small vegetable garden and in volunteer work at his church a way to keep his heart busy and his hands active. His hands, thick and calloused, which told stories of decades of honest work, were proof of his dignity. He was not a man of many words, but his gaze had a disarming depth. It was a peace that came not from the absence of problems, but from the certainty that he was not alone in facing them. His faith in God was not a spectacle for others to see. It was the silent foundation of his existence, the source of his patience, and his refusal to become bitter about the injustices of the world. For almost an hour, Samuel waited in line. He did not complain, nor did he show impatience. He just observed the movement, with the same tranquility with which he tended his plants. To many there, his calmness was a sign that he had nothing more important to do, a testament to his supposed irrelevance. Several glances passed through him, some with pity, others with evident suspicion. A couple whispered, looking in his direction, and he knew, without needing to hear, the kind of thing they were saying. It was a familiar feeling, that of being judged and diminished by the cover before the book was opened. But Samuel had learned long ago that the opinion of men was like the wind, fleeting and beyond his control. He clung to the only opinion that mattered, God's. On the other side of the counter, Ricardo saw the world from a completely different perspective. For him, the bank was a battlefield where he was a general. His uniform was the well-cut suit. His weapons were the met targets and the high-income clients he flattered. In his early 30s, he was overworked, stressed, and convinced that success was the only measure of a man. In his worldview, there was no room for Samuel's simplicity. When his eyes landed on the old man slowly approaching, he didn't see a man but a problem, an obstacle, a piece of the outside world that should not have entered his sanctuary of prosperity. His mind was already formulating the quickest and most efficient way to get rid of that distraction. Finally, it was Samuel's turn. He approached the polished mahogany desk, a stark contrast to his worker's hands. He gave a low and respectful "Good morning," a greeting that was completely ignored. Ricardo didn't even lift his head from the computer immediately. He left Samuel standing for a few seconds, a small power play to reassert his position. When he finally raised his face, his look was one of pure annoyance. He didn't wait for Samuel to explain what he wanted. He had already decided who Samuel was and what he represented. The humiliation that followed was not an accident. It was a deliberate choice, a demonstration of force for an audience that he believed shared his contempt. Ricardo's voice cut through the air, loud and clear enough for everyone around to stop what they were doing. "Sir, if you've come to beg, this is not the place." The silence that fell was immediate and heavy. Conversations stopped. Keyboards fell silent. All eyes turned to the scene, the arrogant and powerful manager, and the old black gentleman standing, receiving the affront in silence. Some faces in the crowd showed slight discomfort, but most displayed a morbid curiosity or a silent complicity. The humiliation was public, calculated to break the man's spirit. It was the materialistic world in its cruelest form, trying to crush a dignity it could not understand. In that moment of crushing silence, Samuel fought his most important battle, and it happened entirely within his heart. Shame tried to settle in. The desire to shrink and disappear fought against the impulse to react. But then he remembered the words of his late wife, Maria. "Samuel, the world will try to diminish you. They will judge you by the color of your skin and the clothes on your body, but they cannot touch your soul. Your soul belongs to God." That memory was like a balm. He felt her presence and, above all, the presence of God, who reminded him, "I am with you." The breath he let out was not of resignation, but of surrender. He surrendered the offense, the pain, and the situation into the hands of the one who knows how to turn humiliation into honor. With the serenity that only prayer can bring, Samuel finally lifted his gaze and fixed it directly on Ricardo's eyes. There was no hatred in his face, not even anger. There was a strange compassion, a sadness for the young man before him who measured the value of life so erroneously. His voice, when it came out, was calm but firm and carried a weight that money cannot buy. "My son," he began, and the words sounded like both a balm and a rebuke. "I just came to check my balance. Man's hurry does not speed up God's time." The response was so unexpected that it disarmed the manager for a second. Everyone expected a shout, an argument, but they received a lesson in wisdom that hung in the air, dense and uncomfortable for those who heard it. Ricardo blinked, caught off guard by the man's calmness and silent authority. Arrogance, however, was a difficult habit to break. A sneer soon returned to his lips. He interpreted Samuel's tranquility as delusion or absurd audacity. "Balance?" he repeated, his voice laden with irony. "Right, let's see the balance then." He extended his hand, an impatient gesture as if he were doing a great favor. In his mind, he was already preparing for the final act of his play, to announce a ridiculously low or non-existent balance out loud, to complete the humiliation and prove that he had been right from the beginning. He wanted to make an example of Samuel for any other unwary person who dared to enter his bank. Without rushing, Samuel placed his identity card and a simple bank card on the mahogany counter, both showing the marks of time. His hands, which had built furniture, cared for the land, and held his wife's hand until her last breath was steady. There was no tremor, no hesitation. Every movement was deliberate, filled with a dignity that contrasted violently with the manager's nervous agitation. That simple gesture of placing the documents on the table was a silent declaration. He did not need to shout to be seen. He was there, present, whole, and refused to be treated as invisible or inferior. The strength of his presence lay in his inner peace, and that was beginning to bother Ricardo in a way he couldn't explain. The silent audience in the bank was now completely captivated. What had begun as casual contempt had turned into an unexpected drama. People leaned forward subtly. Cell phones were forgotten in pockets. Curiosity replaced indifference. Who was this old man? What kind of confidence was it that allowed him to face the manager in that way? There was a tension in the air, a growing expectation. Samuel's serene response had planted a seed of doubt in the minds of some. What if the manager was wrong? The possibility, however small, made the scene irresistible. They were no longer just spectators. They were witnesses to a clash of values, of the power of money against the power of the spirit. Among the employees, a young cashier named Anna watched everything with a heavy heart. She was new to the branch from a small town and had not yet grown accustomed to the coldness of that environment. From the beginning, she felt the injustice in the way the manager treated Samuel. She saw the kindness in the old man's eyes and felt ashamed of her boss's attitude. For a brief moment, her eyes met Samuel's. He gave her an almost imperceptible nod, a small gesture of recognition that filled her with a mixture of relief and courage. She couldn't intervene, for fear of losing her job, but in her silence, she became an ally, a silent supporter of that man's dignity. Ricardo picked up the card and ID with a brusque movement, almost snatching them from the table's surface. He held them with his fingertips as if he were disgusted. It was theater, a performance of superiority for all to see. He turned and walked towards his computer terminal, his straight back expressing all his disdain. For him, this was just the fulfillment of an annoying formality before he could finally expel Samuel from the branch. He had no idea that he was not walking towards a victory, but towards the greatest lesson in humility of his life. Every step he took moved him further from his arrogance and closer to a truth that would shake him to his core. As the manager walked away, Samuel did not watch him with anxiety. His gaze was lost in the bustle of the bank, but he did not see the people. In his mind, he was repeating a verse from the book of Psalms that always comforted him in times of trial. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Those words were his armor. He was not there to prove anything to Ricardo or anyone else. He was there to fulfill a purpose that had been entrusted to him. The humiliation was just background noise, a passing distraction in the grand plan God had for that day and for that money. He felt at peace, anchored on a rock that no human storm could move. Ricardo's short walk to his chair seemed to last an eternity. The silence in the branch was so profound that the sound of his leather shoes on the marble floor echoed like hammer blows. He sat down, adjusted his suit and, with the air of someone about to deliver the final blow, inserted Samuel's card into the reader. His fingers danced quickly over the keyboard, typing the password. Samuel had given him in a low voice. A smug smile was already forming on his face as he prepared to read the result on the screen and announce with satisfaction the failure of that audacious old man. The audience held its breath. The moment of truth, or what Ricardo believed to be the truth, had arrived. The computer screen flickered, processing the information. The soft sound of the machine working was the only noise in the tense environment. Ricardo leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the screen. The sneer fully formed on his lips. He was ready for triumph. He wanted to savor that moment, the confirmation of his judgment, the reaffirmation of his power and his worldview. Samuel's humiliation would be his personal victory, a small medal in his stressful day. He opened his mouth, ready to speak, to declare the number that would put an end to that uncomfortable situation, but the words did not come out. What appeared on the screen was not what he expected. It was not a low balance, nor a zeroed account. Shining in green against the dark background of the banking system, there was a number so large, so unexpected, that Ricardo's brain seemed to stop functioning. The smile on his face froze and then melted away, replaced by an expression of pure disbelief. His eyes widened, the color drained from his face. He leaned in closer, as if proximity could change the digits on the screen. The silence in the branch was no longer one of expectation, but of confusion, as everyone saw the manager's mask of arrogance shatter in an instant. Ricardo's face, normally flushed with self-confidence, turned as pale as wax. A cold sweat began to break out on his forehead. He rubbed his eyes hard, once, twice, hoping the image would correct itself, that it was a system error or a hallucination caused by stress. But the number remained there, motionless, mocking his certainty. 7 digits, a comma, followed by 6 more numbers, and 2 zeros after the decimal point. It was an amount he rarely saw, even in the accounts of his most important clients. It was a fortune that simply did not fit the figure of that man, in worn clothes, standing patiently in front of his desk. Reality had just delivered a punch to his prejudice. Those numbers on the screen seemed to burn into his retina. It was not just money, it was a judgment. Each zero seemed like an eye staring at him, exposing the smallness of his attitude. For a man like Ricardo, who based his entire value system on financial power, seeing that amount associated with the person he had just publicly humiliated was a complete collapse of his worldview. He felt dizzy, disoriented. The authority he so cherished evaporated in an instant, leaving behind only a shocked and deeply ashamed man, exposed before his staff and his clients. His mouth opened and closed a few times, but no sound came out. What Ricardo and no one else in that branch knew was the sacred origin of that money. It was not the result of a sudden inheritance or a lottery prize. It was the result of the sale of a piece of land that had belonged to Samuel's family for generations, a land that his grandparents, children of freed slaves, had bought with the sweat of their labor. And most importantly, that money was not for Samuel. In long nights of prayer after his wife's death, he felt God's call to use that asset for a greater work. The entire amount would be donated to the construction of an orphanage, a project his church community had dreamed of for years. That balance was not Samuel's wealth. It was God's providence manifesting through him. With a trembling voice, almost a whisper, Ricardo finally managed to articulate a few words. This can't be," he muttered to himself, but his voice came out a little louder than he intended. The people closest to him, who were watching his reaction attentively, heard the shock in his voice. A murmur began to spread through the branch like a wave. The initial confusion gave way to collective astonishment. What did the manager see? What could have shaken that self-assured man in such a way? The energy in the place changed completely. The contempt for Samuel turned into a reverent curiosity. Power had shifted in a way so swift and overwhelming that no one could process it. While chaos set in Ricardo's mind, Samuel remained an oasis of calm. He observed the manager's reaction not with triumph, but with the same compassion as before. He knew that this moment was not about him, but about the lesson God was teaching that young man. With the same quiet voice as before, he leaned slightly over the counter, breaking the stunned silence. "Is everything all right, my son?" he asked. The question, laden with genuine kindness, was like a final blow to Ricardo's shattered armor. Coming from the man he had just tried to crush, that display of grace was more humiliating than any accusation. Ricardo looked up from the screen, stunned, and faced Samuel. In the old man's eyes, he found no accusation or contempt, but a peace that made him feel even smaller. The word son echoed in his head. This man, whom he had treated like trash, was offering him a dignity that he himself did not possess at that moment. He tried to answer, but his throat was dry. He could only nod his head, an ambiguous gesture that meant neither yes nor no. He was completely broken, disarmed by the combination of an unexpected fortune and an inexplicable humility. The entire branch seemed to hold its breath, witnessing the crumbling of one man and the silent rise of another. The young cashier, Anna, watching everything from her counter, felt a shiver. She didn't know the details, but the expression on Ricardo's face told the whole story. A wave of relief and a kind of righteous joy washed over her. It wasn't joy at her boss's downfall, but at the restored honor of that gentleman. She saw living proof that appearance does not define anyone, and that true strength does not shout, does not impose itself. It whispers calmly like Samuel's voice. That moment became a landmark in her memory, a lesson she knew she would never forget about character, prejudice, and the mysterious way justice sometimes manifests itself. It was then that Samuel did something that sealed the lesson of that day forever. In the same serene tone of voice, he looked at Ricardo and made his request. "My son, I would like to withdraw just 100 rays, please, for this week's groceries." The simplicity of the request in the face of the immensity of the balance on the screen was what finally broke Ricardo inside. It wasn't about the money. It never was. For that old man, that fortune was just an instrument, a means to an end far greater than himself. The complete lack of attachment, the total detachment, revealed a richness of spirit that Ricardo, with all his obsession for status and capital, could never comprehend. Mechanically, like an automaton, Ricardo processed the withdrawal. His hands, once so agile and precise, were now slow and clumsy. He counted the 100 real notes with difficulty, his mind still spinning, trying to reconcile the man before him with the number on the computer screen. The transaction, which should have been the confirmation of his superiority, became the ritual of his humiliation. Every second was torture. He handed the money and the receipt to Samuel, avoiding his gaze, unable to face the grace and dignity he had tried to destroy. The air was heavy with the unsaid, with the shame and regret that now filled the space once occupied by arrogance. Samuel took the money, the card, and his ID. He put everything away carefully in his worn-out wallet. He did not say a word of reproach, made no gesture of victory. His mission there was accomplished, both the banking and the spiritual one. He knew that silence, at that moment, was more powerful than any speech. The lesson had been delivered not by his words, but by the action of God, who used humility as a weapon and truth as a shield. The climax was not a shout, but the deafening silence of arrogance being defeated by grace. He prepared to leave, leaving behind a changed man and a branch that would never be quite the same again. Before turning to leave, Samuel paused one last time. He looked directly at Ricardo, who was still paralyzed in his chair, his gaze lost. The manager finally raised his head, and his eyes were now teary. Shining with tears of shame he struggled not to shed. He was a man, stripped of all his armor, vulnerable and exposed. Samuel saw the wounded soul behind the facade of arrogance and, once again, felt compassion instead of contempt. He leaned in a little, as a father leans in to speak to a son who has made a grave mistake, and his voice was a balm in the wounded atmosphere. "A man's worth is not in what the bank says he has," said Samuel, and his words, though spoken in a low tone, seemed to echo throughout the entire branch. Everyone close enough to hear felt the weight of that truth. It was not an accusation, but a statement, a piece of wisdom offered freely. Ricardo swallowed hard, feeling each word pierce his pride and touch something deeper, something he had long forgotten. The simple sentence dismantled the entire philosophy upon which he had built his career and his identity. He felt the ground disappear from under his feet, the certainties of his world dissolving. Samuel completed his thought with the same unshakable serenity, but in the peace he carries in his chest. "May God be with you, my son." With this final blessing, he offered Ricardo the forgiveness he did not ask for and the peace he desperately needed. It was an act of pure grace, the perfect closing for a divine lesson. There was nothing more to be said. God's justice did not come with punishment, but with a mercy that was at the same time sharper and more healing than any chastisement. He gave Ricardo the chance to rise again, not as a powerful manager, but as a better human being. Then Samuel turned. With the same straight back and the same calm stride with which he had entered, he began to walk towards the exit. His posture was not that of a winner showing off, but of a servant who had completed his task. He did not look back. As he walked, something remarkable happened. The people in line who had previously looked at him with contempt now instinctively stepped back, opening a path for him to pass. No one dared to touch him or speak to him. The looks were now of fearful respect, of deep admiration. They knew they had just witnessed something that transcended a simple bank transaction. He passed through the glass doors and disappeared into the sunlight outside, leaving behind a reverent silence. The bank, once a place of noise and haste, now felt like a church after an impactful sermon. People did not immediately resume their conversations. They remained in their places, processing what they had seen, the humiliation, the turnaround, the lesson in humility. That old man had entered as an invisible and left as a legend, leaving an indelible mark on the memory of everyone present. The story of the day, a simple man silenced an entire bank with his faith, would be told and retold for years. Ricardo was left alone at his desk, shrunken in his expensive chair that now seemed like a throne of shame. He felt small, naked. The image of Samuel's serene face and the sound of his calm voice would haunt him for a long time. The tears he had been holding back finally rolled down his face, tears not of anger, but of a deep and painful regret. He lowered his head into his hands, the powerful manager finally broken, humiliated not by the power of money, but by the overwhelming force of grace. In that moment of desolation, something new began to sprout in his chest, the desire to change. The seed of humility, planted so harshly, was beginning to germinate. In the weeks and months that followed, the change in Ricardo was remarkable. The arrogance gave way to a careful hesitation. He began to greet all customers regardless of their appearance. He stopped measuring people by what they owned and started trying to see who they were. His colleagues noticed the transformation. The tyrannical manager had disappeared, replaced by a quieter, more reflective and, surprisingly, more human man. The memory of Samuel became his moral compass, a constant reminder of the day he learned the hard way about the true value of a person. That encounter didn't just humiliate him, it saved him. Far away, Samuel's family land was cleared, and the construction of the orphanage began. With each brick laid, with each wall that rose, the purpose of that day in the bank materialized. Samuel visited the construction site every day, not as a proud sponsor, but as a happy servant, helping with small tasks, talking with the workers, praying over the foundation. The money, which had been an instrument of humiliation and then of revelation, was now being transformed into a home for children in need. It was the final proof that God's providence moves the threads of the world in ways that human logic cannot predict, using the faith of a simple man to build a future for many. Samuel never told this story to boast. For him, the episode in the bank was not a personal victory over Ricardo. It was a moment when God used him as a vessel to pour out his lesson. He saw himself only as the pen, but the hand that wrote the story was God's. In his nightly prayers, he did not ask God to punish Ricardo, but to heal his heart. He understood that true victory is not seeing the enemy fall, but seeing him rise, transformed. His faith did not seek revenge, but redemption, both for himself and for those who offended him. God's justice, as Samuel learned that day, does not always arrive with the sound of thunder. Sometimes it reveals itself in the silence of a number on a computer screen. Sometimes it speaks through the calm voice of a humble man whose gentle words are capable of demolishing fortresses of pride. And at times, the greatest demonstration of divine power is not the punishment of the arrogant, but the invitation to their transformation, an opportunity for rebirth offered through an unexpected act of grace. The account that God settles is not paid with suffering, but with the awakening of conscience. The story of Samuel, of that day in the bank, became a powerful testimony in his community. It was told not as a story of revenge, but as a miracle of faith in action. It served as a reminder that the Christian's armor is not made of pride or wealth, but of humility, patience, and an unshakable trust that God fights the battles for those who trust in him. And that, in the end, the honor the world tries to steal is always restored in a much grander way by the hands of him who sees the heart. That day left such a strong mark that it became a pillar in the faith of that community. The story taught everyone that even when the world despises us, judges us, and tries to put us in a place of insignificance, our identity is secure in God. The honor of a child of God is not subject to the approval of men, and divine justice, though it may sometimes seem slow, always arrives at the perfect time, not to destroy but to restore, teach, and glorify his name through the most unlikely instruments. And so, the lesson of that day echoes to this day, simple and profound for all who have ears to hear, because the world may judge by appearance and by gold, but God weighs the hearts, and it is in the humility of the righteous that he reveals his greatest glory. Samuel's journey did not end in that bank. It continues to inspire all who hear his story. It reminds us that faith is not the absence of trials, but the strength we find to go through them with dignity and grace, trusting that God is in control of all things, transforming every humiliation into an opportunity for his honor to be manifested before men. If you know someone who is going through a trial and needs their faith strengthened, please share this video. The story of Samuel may be the light that person needs to keep believing. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more testimonies on how faith in God can truly move mountains and silence the arrogant with the strength of peace. Thank you for listening, and may God be with you.